sitting in the middle of it is this human figure who's holding this strange bag in his hand.
A carved symbol that looks strangely familiar kept appearing in ancient sacred scenes.
Brace yourself, because the alternative is that what we are actually seeing is misidentified technology.
But the debate changed when a much older version surfaced at Göbekli Tepe and pushed the question into deep prehistory. Instead of solving the mystery, it widened it. Are we seeing shared memory or pattern hunting gone too far? The image that refuses to disappear. At first glance, the symbol looks almost ordinary, a small handled shape carved beside gods, priests, or sacred figures in ancient stone reliefs. People describe it as a handbag because the silhouette feels familiar, and that familiarity makes the image unusually difficult to ignore once you have seen it. It appears in discussions of Mesopotamian art, in carved ritual scenes, and in visual comparisons that spread quickly online because the shape seems too specific to dismiss casually. The real reason the symbol keeps returning is not only its appearance, but the pattern of attention it creates. Viewers notice the same form in different places, then begin asking whether they are seeing coincidence, shared symbolism, or the surviving trace of a much older idea. That question sits at the center of this story because it turns a curious image into a historical argument, and eventually into a fight over how far cultural memory can travel. Once the motif is treated as more than decoration, the stakes change. The conversation is no longer about a strange carving that resembles a modern object, but about whether repeated sacred imagery can preserve meaning across lost centuries, migrations, and environmental collapse. Hancock's core claim and why it provokes experts. Graham Hancock's central claim is not simply that ancient people were intelligent, because archaeology has demonstrated that many times over. His argument goes further, suggesting that a lost Ice Age civilization, or at least highly capable survivors of one, may have transmitted fragments of knowledge, symbolism, and sacred traditions into later cultures after catastrophic climate upheaval and flooding. That idea resonates with audiences because it offers a dramatic bridge between scattered mysteries. It connects ancient monuments, flood traditions, and recurring symbols into a single narrative of survival, memory, and inheritance. In storytelling terms, it feels satisfying because it gives the past continuity and it treats early humans as witnesses to world-changing events rather than passive primitives waiting for civilization to begin. Experts often push back, not because catastrophe or flooding are controversial, but because the proposed chain of transmission usually exceeds what current evidence can securely prove. Archaeologists and historians typically require datable material, documented context, and demonstrable links between cultures before accepting claims of continuity on this scale. A repeated motif, even an intriguing one, can raise a question, but by itself, it cannot confirm a global survivor network. This tension is what makes the debate so persistent. Hancock highlights patterns that feel too striking to ignore, while specialists warn that pattern recognition can outrun evidence, and the gap between those positions becomes the engine driving the entire argument forward. A world shattered by water and climate. To understand why this theory has such force, you have to step back into the violent end of the last ice age, when coastlines, weather systems, and human survival patterns were changing across generations. Between the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene, warming climate phases, meltwater pulses, and rising seas reshaped enormous areas that earlier communities may have occupied for centuries. This matters because many of the most attractive places for human settlement were coastal zones, river mouths, and fertile margins that are now underwater or radically altered. If people built, traded, worshipped, or preserved early traditions in those landscapes, then part of that record may now lie submerged beneath continental shelves, buried under sediment, or destroyed by repeated shoreline movement. In that context, missing evidence does not automatically mean nothing happened there, and that possibility gives alternative historical theories room to breathe. At the same time, the scientific caution remains valid, because archaeology cannot fill gaps with imagination alone. A destroyed coastline can explain why evidence is scarce, but it cannot prove what kind of culture once stood there, how advanced it was, or whether its survivors carried a coherent symbolic system into later civilizations. This is where the debate becomes more interesting than a simple argument about belief. Catastrophe, migration, and memory are all historically plausible, and post-glacial disruption is a confirmed reality, but the scale and continuity of transmission remain open questions. That uncertainty creates the perfect stage for Göbekli Tepe, a site that did not emerge from a drowned coastline, yet still forced researchers to rethink how early complex ritual life should be dated. Göbekli Tepe and the timeline shock. In southeastern Turkey, on a hilltop long used and then buried in prehistory, Göbekli Tepe entered the modern archaeological conversation as a site that seemed to arrive from the wrong time. Excavations revealed circular and oval enclosures built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars, many of them carved with animals, abstract forms, and symbolic imagery that suggested ritual intent rather than ordinary domestic life. What made the discovery so disruptive was not only the scale of the stonework, but its age. The main monumental phases are dated to roughly 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, placing the site deep in the early Neolithic and far earlier than the monumental traditions many people once assumed should come first in the story of civilization. In practical terms, Göbekli Tepe showed that organized symbolic labor, ceremonial architecture, and complex shared meaning could appear before later urban systems took shape. For this script's central question, the most striking detail sits on Pillar 43, often called the Vulture Stone. In the upper register of that carved pillar, researchers and viewers alike note three handbag-like motifs, small-handled forms positioned within one of the site's most discussed symbolic panels. Whether those shapes represent literal containers, ritual signs, or something more abstract remains debated. But their presence matters because they place the familiar motif in sacred monumental imagery more than 11,000 years ago. That timeline does not prove Hancock's full theory, and it does not establish a direct line to every later culture where similar imagery appears. It does, however, change the emotional and intellectual weight of the conversation, because the symbol is no longer only a later civilizational curiosity. It now stands inside one of the oldest known monumental ritual landscapes on Earth, and that alone forces the debate into deeper time, what the symbol could mean and what it cannot prove. Once the motif appears at Göbekli Tepe, the question becomes harder and more disciplined at the same time, because visual resemblance can inspire theories, but interpretation still requires caution. The handled shapes on Pillar 43 may represent containers, ritual objects, symbolic emblems, or stylized forms whose original meaning is now inaccessible without supporting texts. Since Göbekli Tepe predates writing, there is no inscription beside the carving to tell us what the makers intended, and that silence is exactly why the image attracts so much projection. Scholars tend to emphasize context over resemblance alone, asking where the motif appears, what figures surround it, and how it relates to the rest of the carved panel. In that approach, the symbol matters most as part of a ritual visual system, not as an isolated icon detached from place and chronology. This method protects interpretation from turning every repeated shape into proof of direct transmission, because similar forms can emerge independently in different cultures for practical or symbolic reasons. Even so, the motif remains important because it weakens any simplistic claim that such imagery belongs only to much later civilizations. Göbekli Tepe expands the timeline and complicates the story, forcing both critics and enthusiasts to confront an older symbolic horizon than many popular arguments acknowledge. What it cannot do, at least on its own, is prove a single lost global civilization, a universal code, or a direct uninterrupted lineage stretching across millennia. The strongest conclusion is narrower and more powerful. The symbol's recurrence invites serious comparison, but only when that comparison respects chronology, context, and the difference between a compelling pattern and a demonstrated connection. Why this argument hits so hard? This debate feels unusually explosive because it is not only about stones, dates, or symbols, but about who gets to define the story of human origins in public imagination. Hancock speaks to a widespread sense that official narratives can be too rigid, too slow to change, or too quick to dismiss patterns that ordinary viewers find meaningful. That emotional current gives his arguments power, even when specialists challenge his conclusions, because many audiences hear the dispute as a conflict between curiosity and authority. Archaeologists, however, are not simply defending prestige when they demand stronger evidence. Their caution exists because the past is full of seductive patterns, and once a dramatic story enters popular culture, it can become far harder to correct than to propose. Methods, dating standards, excavation context, and peer review may feel dry compared with a civilization lost to floods narrative, but those tools are exactly what prevent history from collapsing into whatever theory sounds most complete. What makes this clash endure is that both sides are responding to something real. There is genuine uncertainty in deep prehistory, there are real gaps in the record, and there is also a real need for disciplined interpretation, if those gaps are not to be filled by wishful thinking. The result is a public argument that keeps returning because it sits at the intersection of evidence, identity, and the human desire for a story large enough to explain the fragments. Stone memory and the question that remains. When the argument settles, the image still remains, carved into stone by people separated from us by more than 11 millennia, yet recognizable enough to trigger instant comparison. That is why the handbag motif matters, even beyond Hancock, because it acts as a visual hinge between confirmed archaeological discovery and the larger human temptation to connect distant fragments into one story. The most grounded takeaway is not that a lost civilization has been proven, because it has not, and responsible history cannot leap past evidence simply because a pattern is compelling. The deeper conclusion is that sites like Göbekli Tepe have already transformed the timeline of symbolic and monumental human behavior, forcing modern audiences to abandon older assumptions about when complex ritual life became possible. In that sense, the real mystery is not only what the motif meant, but what kinds of memories survive catastrophe, migration, and time. Some memories endure in texts, some in ruins, and some may persist only as shapes repeated across cultures until their original meaning fades, while their presence keeps asking the same question in silence. If this question stays with you, don't stop at the headlines. Follow the evidence, compare the interpretations, and decide for yourself what these stones are really preserving. And if you want more deep history mysteries examined with both curiosity and skepticism, subscribe and keep watching.